Frank's mop bucket hit the concrete floor with a metallic clang that echoed through stage 12 like a gunshot. Vincent Romano's head snapped up, his expensive suit wrinkled, blood on his manicured hands. For a heartbeat that lasted forever, neither man moved. The stunt double, Tommy something, Frank remembered seeing him around the lot, lay twisted at an impossible angle beneath the rigging equipment, his neck clearly broken, but the blood pooling beneath his head told a different story than any stunt gone wrong. Jesus Christ, Romano breathed, straightening slowly. Frank fucking Castellano. Frank's legs nearly gave out. Nobody had called him by his real name in over 2 decades. Here at Universal, he was Frank Castle, the ghost who cleaned up after dreams. But Romano knew exactly who he was, who he used to be, Vinny. Frank's voice came out as a croak. How did you find you? Romano smiled, that same cold smile Frank remembered from Chicago, from the nights when bodies got fed to Lake Michigan. You always were too careful with numbers, Frankie. Too careful for your own good. Frank's mind raced back to 1971, to the ledgers he'd kept for the Torino family, to the night he'd seen too much and run too far. He'd reinvented himself in Los Angeles, became just another working stiff with a fake Social Security number and a studio job that nobody looked at too close. 23 years of emptying trash cans and mopping blood off sound stages where actors pretended to die. Tommy here. Romano gestured casually at the corpse. He was getting curious about our film financing. Kid thought he was going to be some kind of whistleblower. He pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, began wiping his hands. Funny thing about stunt work. Accidents happen all the time. Frank's cleaning cart sat between him and the exit. His keys to every lock on the lot, jangled softly on his belt. But Romano blocked the main door, and stage 12 had no other way out except the overhead catwalks. You're laundering money through Chuck Norris films? Frank couldn't help himself. Even after all these years, the accountant in him was appalled by the sheer audacity. Romano laughed. Bigger than that, Frankie. Way bigger. This whole production, the stunts, the effects budget, the international distribution deals, it's all paper. We're washing $50 million in cartel money through Hollywood accounting. Beautiful, right? Even the IRS doesn't audit movie budgets too hard. The work lights cast harsh shadows across Tommy's young face. Kid couldn't have been more than 25. Probably had dreams of becoming the next Hal Needham, making a name for himself behind the cameras. And Chuck? Frank asked. Chuck doesn't know shit. Shows up, does his scenes with the second unit, collects his check. The real movie gets made in post-production, if we even bother finishing it. Romano's eyes never left Frank's face. But you already figured that out, didn't you? Always were the smart one. Frank thought about his daughter Sarah, 31 years old now, working as a script supervisor somewhere in town. He hadn't spoken to her since she was 8, since he'd abandoned her and her mother to keep them safe from men like Romano. Last he'd heard through the grapevine, she was trying to break into the film business. So what now, Vinny? You gonna make me disappear too? Romano tilted his head, considering. That depends. You still got that gift for keeping your mouth shut? For being invisible? Frank nodded slowly, his heart hammering against his ribs. Good, because tomorrow morning when they find poor Tommy here, it's gonna be a tragic accident. Rigging failure. Happens more than you'd think. Romano straightened his tie. And you're gonna clean up the blood, just like you always do. Nice and neat. No questions. Romano walked past Frank toward the exit, pausing just close enough that Frank could smell his cologne, the same expensive stuff he'd worn in Chicago. Oh, and Frankie, that daughter of yours, Sarah, right? Heard she just got hired as a script supervisor, on this very production. Romano's smile turned predatory. Small world Hollywood. Be a real shame if she had an accident too. The soundstage door slammed shut, leaving Frank alone with Tommy's body and the weight of 30 years crashing down on him. His hands shook as he reached for his mop, muscle memory taking over even as his mind reeled. He'd spent 2 decades cleaning up other people's messes, staying invisible, keeping his head down. But Romano had found him anyway. And worse, Sarah was here, somewhere in this web of blood, money, and murder. Frank looked down at Tommy's lifeless eyes, then up at the security camera mounted in the corner of stage 12. Its red light blinked steadily in the darkness. Maybe, after 23 years of being invisible, it was time for Frank Castellano to be seen. The security camera's red light pulsed like a mechanical heartbeat as Frank stared up at it, Tommy's blood seeping into the concrete beneath his knees. 23 years of invisibility, of being the gray ghost who moved through Universal's stages like furniture, and now that blinking eye in the corner might have recorded everything. Romano's threats, Tommy's murder, Frank's own face, exposed after decades of careful anonymity. His hands trembled as he wrung out the mop, the water in his bucket turning pink. Muscle memory guided him through the motions. He'd cleaned blood before, prop blood mostly, sometimes real blood from onset accidents, but never murder. Never this deliberate erasure of a young man's dreams. The work lights hummed overhead, casting everything in harsh relief. Tommy's face looked younger in death, baby-faced and trusting. Frank had seen him around the lot for weeks, always eager, always asking questions about camera angles and safety protocols. The kid reminded Frank of himself at that age, hungry to understand how things worked, to peek behind the curtain of the entertainment machine. Now Tommy was just another mess to clean up. Frank's lower back ached as he worked, the familiar burn of too many years bent over a mop bucket. At 62, his body was a catalog of small betrayals, arthritic knuckles that stiffened in the morning, a left knee that clicked when he stood too fast, reading glasses he kept forgetting he needed. The gray uniform hung loose on his shrinking frame, size large becoming too large as the years carved away at him. But it was Romano's mention of Sarah that made his chest tight with something deeper than physical pain. Sarah, his daughter, the little girl with paint-stained fingers who used to build elaborate block cities in their Chicago apartment, narrating elaborate stories about the tiny people who lived inside. She'd been 8 when he kissed her forehead for the last time, told her daddy had to go away for work. Margaret had understood. You don't cross the Torino family and stick around to see what happens next. But Sarah had cried, clinging to his leg in that way children do when they sense the world shifting beneath their feet. 23 years of silence, 23 years of wondering if she'd forgiven him, if she even remembered him. He'd followed her life from a distance. Graduation photos Margaret's sister posted in Christmas cards, a brief mention in Variety when she'd worked as a production assistant on some indie film. She'd kept his last name, which surprised him, Castellano, the name he'd buried along with everything else from his Chicago life. The irony tasted bitter as sawdust. He'd spent 2 decades invisible, protecting her by staying away, and now she'd walked straight into Romano's web, a script supervisor on a Chuck Norris production that was really a $50 million money laundry. The danger he'd run from had circled back to claim the one thing he'd sacrificed everything to protect. Frank straightened slowly, his spine popping like bubble wrap. The blood was gone now, the concrete damp but clean. Tomorrow morning, some assistant director would find Tommy's body positioned beneath the rigging equipment, and everyone would shake their heads about the tragic accident. Dangerous business, stunt work. These things happened, except Frank knew better. Frank had always known better. It's what had made him valuable to the Torinos, and what had nearly gotten him killed. The stage felt enormous around him, a cathedral of shadows and possibility. During the day, it would fill with crew members and equipment, the controlled chaos of movie making. Directors would shout directions while camera operators framed shots, and somewhere in that organized madness, Sarah would sit with her clipboard and stopwatch, making sure every detail matched between takes. She'd be close enough to touch, and Frank wouldn't be able to acknowledge her existence without putting her in even greater danger. He wheeled his cart toward the exit, keys jingling softly. The sound echoed off the high ceiling, lonely as a wind chime. In a few hours, the night security guard would make his rounds, flashlight beams sweeping across the empty stages. But Frank knew which corridors to avoid, which shadows would hide him. After 23 years, Universal Studios was mapped in his bones. The lot stretched out before him in the pre-dawn darkness, a small city of dreams and manufactured magic. Somewhere out there, in an apartment he'd never seen, Sarah was probably sleeping. Did she still talk in her sleep like she had as a child? Did she still scrunch her nose when she concentrated? Frank locked stage 12 behind him, sealing away the evidence of Romano's work. The security camera had recorded everything, but he'd learned long ago that evidence only mattered if someone with power wanted to see it. In Hollywood, like Chicago, money had a way of making inconvenient truths disappear. But Frank Castellano had spent 23 years perfecting his own kind of invisibility. And now, with his daughter's life hanging in the balance, he was beginning to realize that being unseen might be the greatest weapon he possessed. The red light continued blinking in the darkness, patient as a predator. The payphone rang at exactly 3:47 a.m. Frank froze halfway across the studio lot, his cleaning cartwheels locked mid-squeak. The sound cut through the pre-dawn silence like a blade, sharp, insistent, wrong. Nobody called the payphone outside Stage 9. Hell, most people didn't even know it still worked. Frank had discovered it years ago during one of his late-night rounds, a relic from the days when crew members actually needed quarters to call home. It rang again, then again. Frank's keys felt heavy on his belt as he approached the booth. The phone was ancient, black bakelite with a metal cord, probably installed sometime in the 70s. Its harsh fluorescent light flickered like a dying star against the California darkness. On the 6th ring, Frank lifted the receiver. "Frank Castellano," a voice said before Frank could speak. Not Romano's voice, someone older, raspier, a voice that reached across 30 years and grabbed him by the throat. "Sal?" Frank's whisper barely escaped his lips. Sal Torino laughed, the same wet chuckle that used to echo through the back room of his Chicago restaurant. "You sound surprised, Frankie. Like maybe you thought I was dead." Frank's free hand gripped the phone booth's metal frame. Sal Torino, Don of the Chicago family Frank had once kept books for. The man whose nephew had ended up in Lake Michigan after Frank discovered the nephew was skimming from the casino receipts. The man Frank had testified against, briefly, before the witness protection placement fell through and he'd had to run on his own. "I heard you died. Heart attack. 1987. That's what we wanted people to hear. Turns out federal prison was bad for my health, but not quite that bad." Sal's breathing was labored, heavy. "Got out 2 years ago. Been looking for you ever since." The studio lot stretched endlessly around Frank, sound stages looming like sleeping giants. Somewhere in the distance, a security guard's flashlight bobbed between buildings. Normal, routine, everything exactly as it should be, except for the voice from his buried past crackling through an impossible phone call. "How did you find you? Romano's not the only one with connections in Hollywood, Frankie. You think money laundering through movies is some new idea? We've been washing cash through film productions since the 60s. Universal, Paramount, even Disney, when we need to move family money." Sal coughed, a harsh sound that spoke of too many cigarettes and not enough clean air. "Romano's operation is small time compared to what we've got running." Frank's mind raced. If Sal was alive, if he'd been out of prison for 2 years, then Romano wasn't just freelancing. This whole Chuck Norris production, Tommy's murder, the $50 million in cartel money. It was all connected to something bigger. Something Frank had stumbled into the middle of without understanding the scope. "What do you want, Sal?" "What I've always wanted. The ledger, Frankie. The real one. The one you kept before you decided to grow a conscience and disappear on us." "The ledger." Frank's chest tightened. In 1971, as the Torino family's accountant, he'd kept meticulous records of every transaction, every payment, every body that got dumped when the math didn't add up. But the ledger Sal was talking about was different. His insurance policy, the complete record of every corrupt cop, every bought judge, every politician who'd taken Torino money. Names, dates, dollar amounts, enough evidence to destroy half of Chicago's power structure. Frank had hidden it before he ran. Hidden it so well that even he sometimes wondered if he could find it again. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Sure you do. And here's the thing, Frankie. I'm old, 78 years old with emphysema and maybe 6 months to live. But my grandson, he's young, smart, ambitious, and he wants to expand the family business out west." Sal's voice dropped to barely a whisper. "Romano's been telling him about your daughter, about how she's working right there on our set, how easy it would be for accidents to happen." The parking lot tilted around Frank. Romano wasn't just threatening Sarah, he was taking orders. The whole production was a Torino operation, and Frank had walked Sarah straight into the middle of it by staying silent all these years. "Your grandson," Frank said slowly, He knows about me? He knows everything, Frankie. About Chicago. About why you ran. About the ledger you took with you. Sal coughed again, the sound wet and final. And he knows about Margaret. The world stopped. Margaret, his ex-wife, Sarah's mother, the woman who'd understood why he had to disappear and had never once tried to find him. What about Margaret? She's been working for us, Frankie, for 23 years. You think it was coincidence that Sarah got interested in movies? That she ended up in Hollywood? Margaret's been steering her toward this moment since she was a kid. The phone receiver slipped in Frank's sweating palm. Everything he'd believed, everything he'd sacrificed to keep Sarah safe, it was all a lie. Margaret hadn't understood. She'd been working for the Torinos all along, grooming their daughter for this exact moment. The ledger, Frankie. You've got 48 hours. The line went dead. Frank stood in the flickering fluorescent light, the receiver buzzing in his hand like an angry wasp. Around him, Universal Studios continued its sleeping routine. Security guards making rounds, automatic lights switching on and off, the machinery of dreams grinding forward in the darkness. But Frank Castellano's careful invisibility was over. 23 years of hiding, and the past had found him through a payphone that shouldn't have worked, connected to a dead man who wasn't dead, talking about a daughter who'd been a pawn since childhood. He hung up the phone and started walking toward stage 12, where the security camera was still recording everything with its patient red eye. The hunt was over. Now it was time to stop running. Frank's legs carried him forward on autopilot, but his mind kept circling back to that payphone like a moth around a flame. The conversation with Sal felt like a fever dream. Impossible, surreal, the kind of nightmare that makes perfect sense until you wake up. Except Frank wasn't waking up. The fluorescent afterimage still burned in his retinas, and Sal's rasping voice echoed in his skull like tinnitus. Margaret's been steering her toward this moment since she was a kid. He stopped walking. Just stopped, right there between stages 7 and 8, his cleaning cart bumping into his legs. The impact jarred something loose in his chest, a sound that might have been a laugh if it hadn't hurt so much. 23 years. 23 goddamn years of believing he'd protected them by staying away, of carrying the weight of abandonment like some noble sacrifice. And all that time, Margaret had been working for the Torinos, grooming Sarah, positioning her like a chess piece for this exact moment. No. Frank shook his head, starting to push the cart again. It didn't make sense. Margaret had cried when he left, real tears, not the crocodile kind. She'd understood why he couldn't stay, why loving them meant leaving them. The Torinos would have killed his whole family to send a message about what happened to accountants who grew consciences. But the doubt was there now, crawling under his skin like a parasite. His keys jangled as he walked, the familiar weight and rhythm that had marked his movements for over 2 decades. Frank knew every key on the ring by touch, master keys for stages, administrative buildings, equipment sheds. The studio had given him access to everything because janitors were invisible, trusted with secrets simply because no one believed they were worth talking to. Stage 12 loomed ahead, its red security light blinking through the high windows. Inside, Tommy's body was positioned beneath the rigging equipment, exactly as Romano had arranged it. In 3 hours, when the day crew arrived, someone would scream. There would be sirens, police tape, hushed conversations about safety protocols and tragic accidents. The machinery of denial would grind into motion, powered by Hollywood's endless capacity for believing its own lies. Frank had seen it before. Not murders, those were rare, but cover-ups, affairs hidden, drug problems buried, financial irregularities smoothed over with accounting tricks that would have made the Torinos proud. The industry protected its own, as long as their own generated revenue. He pulled out his cell phone, a cheap flip model he'd bought at a gas station, and stared at the blank screen. He could call 911, report what he'd seen, let the police sort through Romano's lies and Tommy's blood and the security footage that probably showed everything. But then what? Frank Castellano, janitor, had no reason to be on stage 12 at 3 in the morning. His story would fall apart under questioning, especially once they ran his prints and discovered his real identity. The carefully constructed life he'd built would crumble, and Sarah would still be trapped in the Torino's web. Worse, if Sal was telling the truth about Margaret. Frank closed the phone. He needed to see Sarah first. needed to look in her eyes and know if she was a willing participant or just another victim. The script supervisor office would have contact sheets, call times, maybe even her address. Information he could access without triggering suspicions, because janitors cleaned everywhere and no one questioned their presence. The night air carried the scent of jasmine from the landscaping between stages. California perfume sweet and cloying, nothing like the harsh winters of Chicago where everything smelled like exhaust and resignation. Frank had grown to love the mild climate, the way palm trees swayed like lazy dancers in the constant breeze. For 23 years, Los Angeles had been sanctuary. Now it felt like a trap closing around him. A security guard's golf cart puttered past stage 15, headlight cutting a white slice through the darkness. Frank recognized the silhouette. Jerry Valdez, 15 years on the lot, a good man who minded his own business and never asked why the janitor worked such strange hours. Jerry raised a hand in greeting, and Frank waved back automatically. Normal, routine. Two night shift workers acknowledging each other in the Hollywood darkness. If only Jerry knew that one of them was a dead man walking. Frank reached stage 12 and stopped, his hand hovering over the lock. The key felt cold between his fingers. Inside, Tommy's body waited in the artificial darkness, surrounded by the tools of cinematic illusion. Outside, the red security light blinked with mechanical patience, recording everything and understanding nothing. Frank thought about the ledger hidden somewhere in his past, about Margaret's supposed betrayal, about Sarah walking unknowingly through Romano's crosshairs. Too many variables, too many lies built on top of older lies, creating a house of cards that would collapse at the slightest breath. But for the first time in 23 years, Frank Castellano wasn't sure he wanted to stay invisible anymore. The key turned with a soft click, and the darkness swallowed him whole. The darkness inside stage 12 felt different now, heavier, pregnant with secrets that demanded acknowledgement. Frank's flashlight beam swept across the rigging equipment where Tommy's body lay sprawled in Romano's carefully choreographed accident. But Frank wasn't looking at the corpse anymore. He was studying the security camera mounted near the ceiling, its red light still blinking with mechanical indifference. 23 years of invisible work had taught him to read surveillance systems like sheet music. This camera was recording to digital storage, probably backing up to servers in the administration building. The footage would show Tommy's accident, but it would also show Romano staging it. Evidence of murder, time-stamped and archived. Frank climbed the metal stairs to the camera platform, his footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. The digital recorder was a newer model, Sony professional grade, the kind of equipment that captured every detail in high definition. He found the access panel and pulled out his master key ring. Security guards weren't the only ones who needed universal access at Universal Studios. The panel opened with a soft click. Inside, rows of memory cards stored weeks of footage from cameras throughout the lot. Frank's hands moved automatically, muscle memory from his accounting days when organizing information meant survival. Each card was labeled with dates and locations. He found tonight's recordings and slipped them into his pocket. Then he saw something that made his blood freeze. Another memory card, labeled differently from the rest. Personal, MC. MC Margaret Castellano. Frank's hands shook as he examined the card. It was older, a different brand from the studio's standard equipment. Someone had hidden it among the official recordings, disguised but not deleted. He slipped it into his pocket alongside the murder footage. The walk back to his cart felt like swimming through molasses. Each step carried the weight of 23 years collapsing into this moment. Margaret had been here, on this lot, close enough to hide evidence in security systems, close enough to watch him work, invisible in his gray uniform, while she orchestrated something he was only beginning to understand. Frank's phone buzzed. Text message from an unknown number, Storage Unit 247, Sunset Self-Storage, Glendale. Key taped under your cart's left wheel. You have 40 hours now. S. Sal was still pulling strings, still orchestrating moves from whatever shadow he'd crawled out of. Frank knelt beside his cart and felt along the left wheel until his fingers found the small metal key secured with electrical tape. The adhesive was fresh. Someone had placed it there recently, probably while he was inside dealing with Tommy's body. They'd been watching him all along. The drive to Glendale took 30 minutes through empty streets, Frank's Honda Civic coughing through intersections while his mind raced through possibilities. Storage Unit 247 could contain anything, more evidence, a trap, or answers he wasn't ready for. But the memory card in his pocket felt like a live grenade, and he needed somewhere private to detonate it. Sunset Self-Storage squatted between a 24-hour donut shop and a defunct mattress warehouse, its orange security lights casting everything in sick amber. Frank's key opened the facility gate and led him down rows of identical metal doors until he found 247. Inside the unit, a single folding chair sat facing a small television and VCR setup. On the TV screen, a handwritten note was taped, "Play the card first, then watch the tape." M. Margaret's handwriting. The same careful script that used to leave notes in Sarah's lunchbox that had written birthday cards Frank could never send. Frank inserted Margaret's memory card into the TV's card reader. The screen flickered to life, showing security footage from Universal Studios dated 3 weeks ago. The timestamp showed 2:17 a.m., Frank's usual shift. On screen, Frank watched himself clean stage 9, methodical and invisible. But the camera angle was wrong, positioned too low, too personal. This wasn't official security footage. Someone had been specifically recording him, studying his movements, learning his patterns. The footage jumped forward. Different dates, different stages, always showing Frank working alone in the darkness. Weeks of surveillance, months maybe. Then the final clip, Frank entering his small apartment in Burbank, shot from across the street with a telephoto lens. Margaret's voice came from behind the camera, barely a whisper. "I'm sorry, Frank. I'm so goddamn sorry." The screen went black. Frank's hands trembled as he reached for the VCR tape. The label read for Sarah, the truth about her father. But underneath, in different ink, someone had added, "He was the best man I ever knew." The tape clicked into place. Margaret's face appeared on screen, older than Frank remembered, lined with 23 years of carrying secrets. She was sitting in what looked like a hotel room, Venetian blinds casting prison bar shadows across her features. "Frank," she said to the camera, "if you're watching this, then Sal found you. And I'm probably already dead." Frank's finger hovered over the stop button, but Margaret's voice held him frozen in the plastic chair. "I need you to understand something before you hate me," she continued, her eyes staring directly into the camera with an intensity that made Frank's chest ache. "Everything Sal told you tonight was a lie. I never worked for the Torinos. I've been running from them just like you." The storage unit felt like a tomb around Frank, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead like an angry insect. Margaret's words didn't make sense. Sal had been so certain, so specific about her betrayal. "When you disappeared in '71, they came for us," Margaret said. "Not right away. They're smarter than that. They waited 6 months, let us think we were safe. Then one night, 2 men broke into our apartment. They put a gun to 3-year-old Sarah's head and told me I had a choice, help them find you or watch our daughter die." Frank's hands gripped the chair arms until his knuckles went white. On screen, Margaret wiped her eyes with shaking fingers. "So I became their spy. For 23 years, Frank. I fed them information about you, where you might be, what you might do. But every lead I gave them was false. Every tip was designed to send them in the wrong direction. I became an expert at looking helpful while keeping you hidden." The revelation hit Frank like a physical blow. All these years he'd believed Margaret was safe because he'd stayed away. Instead, she'd been fighting a secret war to protect him, lying to killers while raising their daughter alone. "The movie career was my idea," Margaret continued. "I knew Sarah had inherited your attention to detail, your ability to see things others missed. I thought if I could get her into Hollywood, into the background where people don't look too closely, she'd be safe from the family business. Script supervisors are invisible, just like janitors." Frank laughed bitterly. Both parents trying to hide their child in plain sight, teaching her to become invisible in different ways. "But I was wrong about something, Frank. The Torinos didn't just want the ledger. They wanted to make sure you could never testify against them. 3 weeks ago, I found out they'd finally tracked you down. Sal's grandson, Tony, had discovered Romano's operation and realized who you really were. Margaret leaned closer to the camera, her voice dropping to an urgent whisper. Romano doesn't know he's working for the Torinos. He thinks he's freelancing, using the Chuck Norris film to wash cartel money. But Tony's been positioning pieces for months. He got Sarah assigned to this production. He arranged for Romano to use stage 12, where you'd eventually find the body. He even made sure you had access to the security footage. The pieces clicked into place with horrible clarity. Frank hadn't stumbled onto Romano's operation by accident. He'd been maneuvered into discovering it. The whole thing was an elaborate setup designed to force him out of hiding. They want you to run, Frank. Not because they're afraid of the ledger, but because they need you to lead them to it. Tony's convinced that after 23 years you might have forgotten where you hid it. So they're going to follow you, let you retrieve it, then take it and kill both of us. Margaret's image flickered as the old tape struggled with playback. When it stabilized, tears were streaming down her face. I recorded this 3 days ago before I tried to stop them. By now, Tony probably knows I was feeding him false information all these years. He'll come for me first, then use my death to motivate you. Her voice broke. I'm sorry I couldn't protect you better. I'm sorry I couldn't be the wife you deserved. Frank reached toward the screen, his fingers touching the cold glass where Margaret's face smiled through her tears. The ledger is hidden where we carved our names, Frank. You'll remember. And when you find it, don't give it to them. Use it. Every name in that book is still alive, still in power. They're Tony's protection, but they could be your weapon. Margaret glanced at something off camera, fear flashing across her features. Sarah doesn't know about any of this. She thinks her father abandoned us for another woman. I let her believe that because hatred was easier than hope. Margaret looked back at the camera. Tell her the truth, Frank. Tell her that everything we did was because we loved her too much to let her become what we were. A door slammed somewhere in Margaret's hotel room. She reached toward the camera, her voice urgent and desperate. They're here. Frank, remember what I told you about Tony? The screen erupted in static, then went black. Frank sat in the silence of the storage unit, Margaret's final words echoing in his mind. But it was her unfinished warning about Tony that made his blood run cold. What had she been about to reveal about Sal's grandson? Outside, a car engine started in the storage facility parking lot. Frank grabbed the memory card and ejected the tape. His 23 years of hiding finally over. Time to remember where two young lovers had once carved their names into Chicago stone. Frank stuffed the memory card and tape into his jacket pocket, his fingers shaking as the storage unit's fluorescent light buzzed overhead like a dying insect. Margaret's final words about Tony echoed in the silence, an unfinished warning that felt like a loaded gun pointed at his chest. The car engine outside had gone quiet. Frank killed the TV and moved to the storage unit door, pressing his ear against the cold metal. Footsteps on gravel, careful and deliberate. Someone was walking between the rows of units, close enough that Frank could hear the soft scrape of shoes on asphalt. He eased the door open an inch and peered through the gap. A figure moved past the orange security lights 3 rows away, tall, wearing a baseball cap pulled low, too distant to make out features. But the gait was young, confident. Someone who belonged in shadows. Tony. Frank let the door close and leaned against it, his mind racing. Margaret had been trying to warn him about something specific regarding Sal's grandson, something beyond the obvious fact that Tony was orchestrating this entire nightmare. What had she discovered in those final days before they killed her? Because they had killed her. Frank knew it with the certainty of a man who'd spent decades reading between the lines of mob operations. Margaret's tears, her desperate urgency, the way she'd reached toward the camera as the door slammed. Those weren't the actions of someone who expected to survive the night. His phone buzzed. Another text from Sal. Time to go home, Frank. Chicago's waiting. Home. The word tasted like ashes in Frank's mouth. Chicago meant Lincoln Park Zoo, where he'd taken Margaret on their second date. It meant the old stone bridge over the lagoon, where they'd carved FC plus MW forever into weathered limestone with his pocket knife. Young lovers believing in forever, too stupid and happy to imagine that forever might last exactly 4 years. The ledger was there, wrapped in plastic and sealed in a coffee can, buried beneath the bridge where tourists fed ducks and children ran laughing through summer afternoons. Frank had chosen the location because it was public enough to seem safe, permanent enough to survive decades, and sentimental enough that he'd never forget. Even if Alzheimer's took everything else, he'd remember where he'd carved Margaret's initials. Retrieving it meant leaving Sarah alone on Romano's set, walking into whatever trap Tony had prepared. And Frank still didn't understand the game being played. Why had Tony involved Romano at all? Why not simply grab Frank off the street and torture the ledger's location out of him? Unless... Frank's blood went cold as the pieces rearranged themselves into a new, more terrifying pattern. What if Romano wasn't just laundering cartel money? What if the Chuck Norris film was a front for something bigger, something that required Frank's ledger to complete? The names in that book weren't just Tony's protection. They were a directory of every corrupt official, judge, and politician the Torinos had bought over 3 decades. In the right hands, it was worth millions. In the wrong hands, it could topple governments. And Sarah was sitting in the middle of it, invisible in her script supervisor role, taking notes and tracking continuity while murder and conspiracy swirled around her. The footsteps outside had stopped. Frank checked his watch, 4:47 a.m. In 2 hours, Sarah would arrive on set for the morning call. She'd walk onto stage 12, maybe even discover Tommy's body herself. The thought of his daughter's scream echoing through that cavernous space made Frank's chest tighten with protective rage. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he'd memorized but never called. Sarah Castellano, script supervisor. His thumb hovered over the call button. What could he possibly say? "Hi, it's your father who abandoned you 23 years ago. Don't go to work today because mobsters are using your film to launder money, and also I used to be their accountant." She'd hang up. Or worse, she'd think he was crazy and call security. Frank closed the phone. Words wouldn't work, not after 2 decades of silence. But actions might. If he could get to Chicago, retrieve the ledger, and use it to destroy Tony's operation before Sarah walked into danger, the storage unit door rattled. Frank's heart hammered against his ribs as the metal groaned under pressure from outside. Someone was testing the lock, applying just enough force to check if it was secured. The sound stopped, followed by the soft scratch of metal on metal, lockpicks. Frank looked around the small unit desperately. No windows, no back exit, just concrete walls and a single door being methodically opened by someone who knew their craft. He grabbed the folding chair and positioned himself beside the door, raising it like a club. The lock clicked open. Frank held his breath as the door began to roll upward, inch by careful inch. A hand appeared under the gap, then a wrist, then the barrel of a pistol equipped with a suppressor. Time to find out what Margaret had been trying to tell him about Tony. Frank brought the folding chair down hard on the emerging wrist. The gun clattered across the concrete as someone cursed in pain outside. Frank kicked the pistol deeper into the unit and yanked the door fully open. A young man in his 20s stumbled backward, clutching his wrist. Dark hair, lean build, eyes that held the same cold calculation Frank remembered from Sal's face 3 decades ago. But something was wrong with the resemblance. The features were softer, more refined. Too refined for a Torino. "You're not Tony," Frank said, keeping the chair raised. The young man straightened, wincing as he flexed his injured hand. "No, I'm Michael Romano. Tony's my business partner." His voice carried no trace of Chicago accent, pure California, educated, privileged. "And you just made a very expensive mistake." Frank's mind raced. Romano had a son, someone young enough to move through Hollywood without suspicion, someone who could coordinate between the old mob and the new money laundering operation. But the way Michael spoke, the casual arrogance in his posture, this wasn't a foot soldier taking orders. "Where's your father?" Frank demanded. Michael laughed, the sound sharp and bitter in the confined space. "Dead. Has been for 6 months. Heart attack in his sleep. Very peaceful for a man who specialized in making things messy." He stepped closer, ignoring the chair in Frank's hands. "I inherited his operation, but I improved it. Dad was small-time, washing cartel money through single films. I had bigger vision." The truth hit Frank like ice water. "You're using the Torino connection to expand. My ledger isn't just protection, it's a customer list. Every corrupt official, every bought judge, every politician with dirty money that needs cleaning." Michael's eyes gleamed with entrepreneurial pride. "Your little black book is worth $50 million annually in new business. The Torinos get their cut. I get expansion into markets Dad never dreamed of, and everyone wins. Except the people you kill. Michael shrugged. Danny Morrison got greedy, tried to blackmail my father about the money flows. We couldn't let that spread. His expression hardened. Just like we can't let Margaret's interference continue. Continue? Frank's blood went cold. She's dead. You killed her. Margaret Castellano died in a car accident 3 days ago, Michael said with clinical precision. Brake failure on the 405. Very tragic. He paused, studying Frank's face, but not before she made some interesting phone calls. Turns out your ex-wife had been feeding the Torinos false information for 23 years. Very impressive dedication. Frank felt the world tilt around him. Margaret had died believing she'd protected him, never knowing that her sacrifice had bought him only 3 days of borrowed time. Tony was furious when he found out, Michael continued. Wanted to torture Margaret before killing her, make her suffer for the deception. But I convinced him to be more elegant. Make it look accidental, use her death as motivation instead of revenge. The casual way Michael discussed Margaret's murder made Frank's vision blur red. 23 years of grief and guilt crystallized into pure rage, but he forced himself to stay focused. Sarah was still in danger. What about my daughter? Sarah's useful. She's been documenting our entire operation without knowing it. Every script revision, every schedule change, every person who enters or leaves the set. Perfect records for our real investors. Michael's smile was predatory. When this production wraps, she'll have an accident too. Maybe she'll fall from the lighting rig, just like stunt doubles sometimes do. Frank swung the chair again, but Michael was ready this time. He caught the metal frame and twisted, sending Frank stumbling backward into the storage unit wall. The younger man was stronger, faster, with reflexes honed by years of clean living instead of decades of hiding. The beautiful part, Michael said, advancing on Frank, is that you're going to help us. You're going to retrieve that ledger from wherever you hid it, and you're going to do it because the alternative is watching Sarah die slowly. Frank's hand found the memory card in his pocket, Margaret's final gift, her surveillance footage of the operation. Evidence that could destroy everything Michael had built, if Frank could get it to the right people. You made one mistake, Frank gasped, backing deeper into the unit. What's that? You assumed I still care about staying hidden. Frank pulled out his phone and hit record on the video camera. Michael Romano, son of deceased money launderer Vincent Romano, just confessed to murdering Margaret Castellano and threatening to kill Sarah Castellano. Michael lunged forward, but Frank was already moving. He dove past the younger man toward the storage unit door, the phone clutched in his outstretched hand. If he could reach the parking lot, reach witnesses or security cameras. Michael's hand caught Frank's ankle, sending him sprawling onto the concrete outside the unit. The phone skittered away into the darkness between storage rows. But not before Frank hit send. The video uploaded to the first number in his contacts. Sarah Castellano, script supervisor. Watching his phone's screen fade to black in the shadows between storage units. The video had uploaded. A small miracle of timing and desperation that might be the only thing standing between his daughter and Michael Romano's elegant brutality. Michael stood over him, chest heaving with exertion and rage. You have no idea what you just did. I gave my daughter the truth, Frank said, pushing himself up to his knees. Something I should have done 23 years ago. The sound of approaching sirens cut through the pre-dawn silence. Distant but growing closer, their wail bouncing off the storage facility's metal walls like an approaching storm. Frank smiled grimly. Sarah had always been quick to act, even as a child. She'd gotten his message and called for help. Michael's hand moved toward the gun he'd dropped, but Frank was closer. He lunged forward, his janitor's reflexes finally good for something besides mopping floors. The weapon spun away across the asphalt as both men grappled in the orange glow of security lights. But Frank was 62, worn down by decades of physical labor and the weight of carrying secrets. Michael threw him back against the storage unit wall with enough force to rattle the metal door. Stars exploded across Frank's vision as his head connected with concrete. The police won't matter, Michael gasped, standing over him again. I'll be gone before they arrive. But Sarah won't be safe, not ever. The Torinos have long memories and longer reach. Frank tasted blood, felt warmth trickling down his scalp. Maybe, but they'll have to find her first. What's that supposed to mean? Frank pulled Margaret's memory card from his pocket, the small device catching the security light like a promise. Your father wasn't the only one keeping records. Margaret spent 23 years documenting every Torino operation, every corrupt contact, every dirty transaction. She was building a case, waiting for the right moment to burn them all down. The sirens were getting louder now, joined by the distinct whoop of police helicopters. Sarah hadn't just called 911, she'd called everyone. Michael's face went pale. That's impossible. Margaret was smarter than any of us, Frank said, struggling to his feet. She knew the only way to keep Sarah safe was to make the Torinos too busy saving themselves to worry about revenge. The first police car rounded the corner of the storage facility, its spotlight sweeping across the rows of units like a lighthouse beam. Michael looked toward his car, calculating distances and odds with the cold precision of someone who'd always believed money could buy escape routes. It's over, Frank said quietly. Michael ran. Frank watched the younger man sprint toward the back of the facility, knowing he wouldn't make it. There were too many sirens now, too many lights converging on the area. Sarah's phone call had triggered something bigger than a simple police response. This was federal, coordinated, the kind of operation that only happened when someone important decided to flip the table on organized crime. Margaret's final gift to their daughter, the chance to grow up in a world where the Torino name meant nothing more than an entry in old court records. The police found Frank sitting against the storage unit wall, the memory card held out like an offering. He answered their questions with the calm precision of someone who'd spent 23 years rehearsing this moment. Yes, he was Francesco Castellano, former accountant for the Torino crime family. Yes, he had evidence of ongoing money laundering operations. Yes, he would testify. But first, he needed to see his daughter. 3 months later, Frank sat in a small coffee shop in Burbank, watching Sarah read through a stack of papers that represented the dismantled remains of his old life. The federal prosecutors had been thorough. Michael Romano was awaiting trial. The Torino organization was scattered to the winds, and half the names in Frank's ledger were facing indictment. Sarah looked older than her 26 years, worn down by the weight of learning that her entire life had been built on secrets and sacrifice. But she was alive, safe, free to choose her own invisibility instead of having it forced upon her. "Mom knew all along where you were," she said finally, not looking up from the documents. She was protecting both of us, in her own way. Sarah nodded slowly, then raised her eyes to meet his for the first time since he'd walked back into her life. "I'm not ready to forgive you yet. I know, but I'm not ready to lose you again either." Frank felt something ease in his chest, a tension he'd carried so long it had become part of his skeleton. "I'm not going anywhere. I've got 23 years of stories to tell you, if you want to hear them." Outside, the California sun painted everything in gold, and for the first time in decades, Frank Castellano was exactly where he belonged, visible, present, and finally home.